Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson, Chapter 32, Hypnotism. And so, Beelzebub continued, at this sixth sojourn of mine in person on the surface of that planet Earth of yours, I decided to settle there for a long stay and to become a professional physician there. I did indeed become one, only not such a physician as most of them are there, but I chose for myself the profession of what is called there physician hypnotist. I became such a professional there firstly because during recent centuries only such physician professionals there obtain an entree to all their classes or castes, of which I spoke. And since they enjoy great confidence and authority, ordinary beings are disposed to a sincerity towards them that permits them to penetrate, as is said there, their inner world. Secondly, I decided to become such a professional in order, also parallel with the attainments of my personal aims, to have the possibility at the same time of giving genuine medical assistance to certain of those unfortunates. Indeed, my boy, on all the continents there and among all the beings, to whatever class they may belong, there has been during recent times, and there still is, a great need for just such physicians. I may say that I already had a very wide experience in this specialty, having during my previous elucidation of certain subtle points of the psyche of individual favorites of yours, many times had recourse to methods used there by such a kind of physicians. I must tell you that formerly your favorites, like all the other three-brained beings of the whole universe, were without that particular psychic property which permits them to be brought into what is called a hypnotic state. To get into that state became proper to your favorites, thanks to a certain combination obtained in their psyche, and derived from the disharmony of the functioning of their common presence. This strange psychic property had its rise soon after the destruction of Atlantis, and began to become finally fixed in the presence of every one of them, from the time when their zoostat, that is, the functioning of their being consciousness, began to be divided in two, and when two entirely different consciousnesses having nothing in common with each other were gradually formed in them, namely those two different consciousnesses, the first of which was called by them simply consciousness, and the second, when they finally noticed it in themselves, was called and still continues to be called subconsciousness. If you try clearly to represent to yourself and to transubstantiate in the corresponding parts of your common presence all I am about to explain to you, you will perhaps then thoroughly understand nearly half of all the causes why the psyche of these three-brained beings who have taken your fancy and who breed on the planet Earth has finally become such a unique phenomenon. This psychic particularity, namely of falling into a hypnotic state, is, as I've already said, inherent to the three-brained beings only of this planet of yours. And one can therefore say that if they did not exist, then in all of our great universe there would not exist in general even a being notion of hypnotism. Before explaining to you further about all this, it is here appropriate to emphasize that although during the last 20 centuries almost the entire process of the ordinary waking existence of most of the three-brained beings who have taken your fancy, particularly of the beings of contemporary times, flows under the influence of this inherency of theirs, nevertheless they themselves give the name hypnotic state only to that state of theirs during which the process of this particular property flow in them acceleratedly, and the results of which are obtained concentratedly. And they fail to notice, or as they would say, they are not struck by irregular results of this inherency, which has recently become fixed in the ordinary process of their existences. Because, on the one hand, in the absence in them in general of normal self-perfecting, they have not what is called a wide horizon. And on the other hand, arising and existing according to the principle itoklanos, it has already become inherent in them quickly to forget what they perceive. But when the said results of this inherency of theirs are obtained acceleratedly, concentratedly, then every kind of irregular manifestation, their own and those of others, become real to such a degree that they become acutely obvious even to their bobtailed reason, and therefore unavoidably perceptible. But even if certain of them should by chance notice something illogical in their manifestation or in the manifestations of others, then, thanks to the absence in them of the knowledge of the law of typicality, they at best ascribe it to the particularities of the character of the given beings. This abnormal particular property of their psyche was first constated by the learned beings of the city Gob, of the country Maral-Plessis. And even then, they made it a serious and detailed branch of science, which spread over the whole of the planet under the name of non-responsible manifestations of personality. But later, when the turn of their regular process of reciprocal destruction came round again, this detailed branch of their science, which was then still comparatively normal, began, like all their good attainments, to be gradually forgotten and finally also entirely disappeared. And only many centuries later did this branch of their science again show signs of reviving. But, thanks to the fact that at this period most of the learned beings there had already become learned beings of new formation, they sat upon this new revival so firmly that before the poor thing had time to develop, it soon found its way into their common, what is called, rubbish heap. And this happened in the following way. A humble, learned being there, unlike his contemporaries, Mesmer by name, and by birth from what is called Austria-Hungary, once happened to notice clearly during certain of his experiments the real duality of consciousness in beings like himself. He was greatly impressed by this and devoted himself entirely to this question, which interested him. Continuing to observe and to study, he almost succeeded in understanding the reason. But when later he began making practical experiments for the elucidation of certain details, well, it was just then that there began to be manifested toward him that particularity proper to the learned beings of new formation there. This particularity of the learned beings of the earth of new formation is called pecking to death. As this honest Austro-Hungarian learned being then began making his elucidating experiments, not as all the learned beings of the earth of new formation had in general become mechanized to do, he was, according to the custom there, very meticulously pecked to death. And this process of the pecking to death of this poor Mesmer was then so effective that it has already passed by its own momentum to the learned beings of the earth from generation to generation. For instance, all the books now existing there on the question of this hypnotism, and of such books there are